a status report on the 21st Century Model Concord Vineyard by Thomas Zabadell, Dave Francis, Jenny Wells, Gaylord Brunke, and Rich Blyton from Michigan State University, Department of Horticulture, Southwest Michigan Research and Extension Center, Benton Harbor, Michigan. We acknowledge the thanks to MSU Ag Bio Research, MSU Extension, Project Green, the National Grape Cooperative, the Michigan Department of Ag, and growers like you for support of this work. Thanks to the entire MSU SwimRec staff for their dedicated work on this project. The Michigan Concord statistics are such. Over the past 10-year average period, from 2001 to 2010, the most recent time period for which statistics are available, the average yield in Michigan was 4.1 tons per acre. Over that same time period, through grower discussion, the average cash price paid for those grapes was about $235. This calculates to an average gross receipts per acre during that time period of $964, which means that the profitability for an acre of Concord over the past decade has been marginal. For this reason, the Concord grape industry in Michigan is in early stages of decline. The official vineyard survey from the NASA shows a 350 acre decline from 2006 to 2011. But industry representatives suggest that by now, and with other marginal vineyards going out of production, that figure is possibly as high as 2,000 acres of Concord Vineyard in Michigan has gone out of production. Furthermore, for the past 3 years, the National Grape Cooperative has offered contracts to plant 1,000 acres of new Concord Vineyard. But growers, sensing the lack of profitability in this crop, have opted not to take any of that contract acreage and plant it. So we are in a time period when the profitability of Concord, as it has grown in Michigan, is under question. What modifications can we make to the current Concord Vineyard architecture to increase productivity? What modifications can we make and have these changes compatible with current grower vineyard equipment? There have been many modifications made to Concord vineyards over the years that have indeed increased the productivity on an acre of vineyard. Contrast this very old black and white slide of a standard Concord vineyard with HRU or top wire cordon training and a vine and row spacing of about 9 to 10 feet between rows, and contrast that with this. This is Geneva double curtain training of that same type of vineyard with double curtains down each row. And from the aerial view, you can get a sense of how much more productive this vineyard architecture is in converting sunlight into a crop. And indeed, it is. However, the difficulty in establishing and managing this three-dimensional trellis has caused growers to not adopt this technology. So we are not going to pursue changes into the future involving more complicated three-dimensional architecture of the trellis. Here is a view of Geneva double curtain from just over the top of the canopy, and you can see what a wonderful display of canopy it produces. but growers find it too difficult to implement this technology. Another approach would be to extend the height of the trellis to get more functional leaf area, more canopy exposed to sunlight, as is being done here in a vineyard of Riesling vines with Scott Henry training at the Southwest Michigan Research and Extension Center. However, this 8-foot tall trellis is too tall for current harvesters, mechanical harvesters, to operate on this height of trellis. So we cannot afford to build Concord trellises this tall and use our current equipment, so we're not going in that direction either. Many efforts have been made to create narrow row technology, as seen here in a New York vineyard years ago. And of course, the strategy then is to utilize equipment that is so narrow that it can go down this narrow row, as shown here. This is Mr. Bill Mihelich, a Michigan grower, demonstrating a very narrow row tractor at a field day at Swimrec several years ago. The other option is to create equipment that can go over the top of the trellis, such as shown with this fertilizer spreader in a New York vineyard, Western New York vineyard years ago. And indeed, one grower in particular in Western New York years ago used grape harvester frames to put all kinds of equipment over the row into these narrow rows, but it was such a specialized and such a difficult transition that growers have not opted to put this technology in place. So let's start out with this current commercial standard of a Concord vineyard with rows about 9 feet wide, with a trellis 6 feet tall, about 7 or 8 feet, mostly 8 feet between vines, vines trained to top wire cordon. And let's see what we can do to this vineyard architecture that might make it more productive in the future. Here is that standard 6-foot trellis as the growth begins in the spring, and you can see the shoots growing along the top, somewhat congested, and the bottom of the trellis area is relatively unutilized by leaf area and does not capture sunlight at all early in the growing season, as shown by this photo. Here is a schematic of that standard Concord vineyard, 8 feet between vines, 6 feet tall trellis on a standard top wire cordon training system. From an end view, it would look like this. And note that we have a fruiting zone fairly congested just at the top of the trellis. The canopy eventually develops over the entire vertical height of the trellis, but we do not utilize the leaf area at the bottom of the trellis very well, and indeed some growers actually remove it mechanically or chemically later in the growing season. So one modification we have considered to the current commercial Concord vineyard to increase its productivity is to increase the trellis height to 7 feet, as shown in this schematic. 7 feet is a height that our modern current harvesters can negotiate and can pick the fruit off of. So we have allowed ourselves to dream that far to increase the trellis height to 7 feet. What does this do for us? Well, we have added to this schematic a second fruiting zone and about 4 feet off the ground. So we increase the productivity of the vine with more fruiting of the vine than just on the top. When we increase the crop level, increase the crop stress, if you will, on a vine, that will have a tendency to bring the overall vine size down. So we think when we institute these changes that the smaller vine size will allow us to narrow up the vine spacing from perhaps 8 feet down to 7 feet as shown here. Here's a schematic with an end view of this two-tier cordon training system, and it shows that there are 2 fruiting zones on this trellis as opposed to the single fruiting zone on a current commercial Concord vineyard. Here it is in practice. We've actually had a very few of these grapevines at the Southwest Michigan station, trained to a 7-foot tall, notice the 2x4 extensions on the post, with 2 fruiting zones. We've had this in place since 2005, and we've had some encouraging results. Here it is, the 2-tier cordon system in 2005, starting to grow and looking quite different than the standard top wire cordon of a current commercial Concord vineyard. This is a video right after bloom, and we put this in to show that with the shoe positioning, which we'll talk about in a little while, we keep this canopy quite open, and the fruit, if you can see some of those small clusters developing, is well exposed. There's quite a few clusters at the top right here. And that is encouraging that we can have a larger canopy, and by adding mechanical shoe positioning with our new mechanical shoe positioner, we can keep this canopy open to develop more fruitfulness and to ripen the fruit better than a shaded canopy, which is typical of many of our current vineyards. Here's another video at harvest time in 2011 of the 2-tier cordon, and you can see that we are seeing a lot of the crop exposed to the sun. We don't see that in many current commercial Concord vineyards. More likely we will see a lot of leaves, a lot of layers of leaves piled up over the fruit, and the fruit is rather hidden in the shade below those layers of leaves, but not with this system. Here are some data that we collected in 2011 comparing the standard top wire cordon to 2-tier cordon that was either summer pruned or not. It was a good year. We had on the standard top wire cordon 8.7 tons per acre. Wow, that well exceeds the long-term state average. However, on the 2-tier cordons, we had 11 and 12 tons to the acre. And if you look in the right column, the soluble solids or bricks were identical for all 3. So we did not pay a penalty for that larger yield with the 2-tier cordon. So data like this encourages us to think that we can increase productivity with some of this technology and make it compatible with current commercial equipment. We've set out to make some projections of what the changes that we've been discussing would do to the productivity of a standard Concord vineyard. Furthermore, we're looking at the better Concord vineyards for this technology in Michigan. And so our first assumption is that our standard 6-foot cordon vineyard is going to have an average yield year in and year out of 6 tons per acre. We think if we change to a 7-foot 2-tier cordon in our model vineyard, that we could add perhaps 25% of an increase in yield from the data we've collected thus far, or about a 1.5 ton per acre increase. Similarly, if we change row spacing from 9 feet down to 8 feet, we think that could increase productivity just mathematically by about 12.5% more length of canopy per acre, or about a 3/4 ton per acre advantage. Similarly, looking across this third line of data, if we change the vine density from an 8-foot vine spacing to 7-foot vine spacing, we could increase productivity by 12.5%, or another 3/4 of a ton. And lastly, mechanical shoe positioning is not performed on a regular basis on most Concord acreage in Michigan. And if we institute that, we think that we can increase productivity because of increased fruitfulness of the nodes and increased ability to ripen that fruit by about 10%, or a 0.6 of a ton per acre increase. Adding all that up, a possible 3.6 tons per acre increase. If we add that to our first assumption of a 6-ton vineyard, add the 3.6, it adds up to 9.6, just under 10 tons per acre is our projection. We are planting at the Southwest Michigan Research and Extension Center a rather large vineyard, and it contains 2 experiments to see in the field what we can do with this projected technology. The first of these, experiment 1, has 2 factors. It has the training system comparison of a 6 versus 7-foot 2-tier cordon training system, and because the expected changes that we have in vine size due to increased productivity, we are comparing own-rooted vines, which is typical for a Concord vineyard in Michigan, versus a very vigorous SO4 rootstock. The second experiment really is designed to answer at the same time what kind of vine will be needed with this different strategy of spacing of the rows, spacing of the vines, change in trellis height. So we are comparing 2 factors, the spacing of vines at 7 feet, 8 feet, or 9 feet, along with a whole list of rootstocks, as you can see here, that range greatly in their vigor induction of the vines, so that the least vigorous Riparia gloire at the top and the most vigorous, the most vigor-inducing SO4 rootstock at the bottom. Those are the 2 main experiments in our new model Concord vineyard at Schematic. Well, enough discussion about what might be possible. Let's see what progress has been made to date to put this concept of a new model Concord vineyard actually into practice. In 2010, we began to prepare the site. And here we are at Schematic in the spring of 2010. We've worked up the ground. We are sowing a cover crop of Roundup or glyphosate-resistant soybeans. As they grew out, here we are in early August, looking at the same site with those soybeans growing, and if we take a closer look, we can see that our overspray of Roundup is killing out the pigweed here, and the healthy Roundup resistant soybeans are carrying on. And all of this is designed to try to get rid of a carryover of any weed growth before we plant the vineyard in the next year. All the time that this is going on, we are propagating thousands of vines for the planting in 2011. Here is what the site looked like in the fall of 2010 with the stubble, if you will, from the soybeans appearing. And in the foreground, by the way, is an organic planting of alfalfa for organic hay production. So 2011 was the year in which we planted the vineyard. To our surprise, after our efforts the previous year, we came back with a rather large infestation of field violet, a winter annual that came through our soybean Roundup treatment. So before we could begin working the ground, we had to spray Roundup one more time to take care of this winter annual. And we performed yet another overspray with Roundup to take out this weed before we worked up the ground. We started with a chisel plowing of the ground, then disked the ground, and we had a fairly nice site starting out. Oh, the marking was a challenge because of all of the different spacings of the vines. This took a lot of detailed work, just as much or perhaps more time to measure everything precisely before we began the planting process. Here's some of the lines that show where we were going to plant the vines as we went down the rows. Then the planting began, and here's some of our swimwear crew on a modified tree planter putting vines in the ground. After they're put in the trench, we have to go back and finish the planting job, straighten up the vines a little, make sure that there's soil around each vine before we fill in the trench. And this went on row after row. We have 66 rows of vines in this large planting. Then we hilled up and filled in the trench, as you can see here, and there's an orange tag on a grapevine in the foreground. You can see that we are using discs to push in a mound of soil around the vines before we proceed with any other steps. And here we have it, the start of our new vineyard in early May 2011. Unfortunately, the commercial nursery that was propagating the grafted portion of the vineyard stock was unable to fill our complete order for the SO4 rootstock. So rather than be behind a year, we opted to have that nursery perform some green grafting of Concord onto SO4 rootstock. And these are vines that were begun in a greenhouse in February of 2011, shipped to us in June of 2011, and we planted them out about a month late in 2011 to complete the planting of the vineyard. Here's what they look like just before we put them into the trench here and covered them over. And we had to baby those quite a bit through the growing season to get them to harden off. We did put in a trickle irrigation system to help them along, and fortunately by 2012, when the spring came, they did survive and actually did quite well in 2012. Here they are after we've put soil all around to stand them up appropriately in the trench in 2011. Another step in the process is weed spraying, and here's Gaylord Brunke putting on a weed spray on our newly planted vines. And because our vineyard is on sloping ground, we were concerned that we could get a lot of washing if we had a sudden large rain, so we immediately began to sow a cover crop in the row middles as shown here with Dave Francis at the controls. And by the latter part of the 2011 growing season, we had nice growth to the Concord vines and a nice start in most parts of the vineyard of a cover crop in the row middles. Unfortunately, due to budgetary situations, we did hold back on installing the trellis in the first year and opted to go for installation of the trellis in the following year. So here we are starting 2012, and the first thing we did was to work on that trellis. It's a big job, very big job. We have 66 rows. That means 132 end posts, as you can see them being installed here. Here's Rich Blyton telling Gaylord, who's in the tractor, when the hole is deep enough and at the right angle and the right location to install the end post. And here's a view a little later in the season with the line posts showing after we've got them in. The row middle cover is growing up, and might as well say right now, our resources in 2012 were limited, so we couldn't do everything ideally, so we probably should have had the row middle mowed by now, but we let it go to seed. Then we mowed it. Those patches of sod around some of the posts were left there intentionally to stop any flow of water down the area under the trellis should we have a big rain that might wash down the hill here. So here we are with the second year growth of the vineyard beginning, and it looked pretty good. With good weed control starting out, and we decided that we would work as our resources allowed through the growing season to complete the installation of the trellis. Here we have Jenny Wells at the controls putting on a cover spray of mostly a fungicide. Occasionally we put on an insecticide to control things like Jap beetle, but other than that, things were kept healthy through the growing season. And this is what it looked like going into July. We were lagging behind in our weed control the latter part of the season, in part due to budgetary situations, and the same with completing the trellis installation. But we did work our way through it. Here's Jenny and Gaylord. Jenny's putting a staple on top of the post to complete the installation of the trellis, and by the latter part of the growing season in 2012 we had the complete installation of the trellis for this new vineyard. Unfortunately, our weed control was getting away from us due to resource limitations. Nevertheless, we have a pretty good start to this new project. About 4,000 vines, almost 2,000 posts, over 10 miles of trellis wire involved with this installation, and a good start to the whole project. The end of year 2. Now our ambitious goal is not only to create a new Concord vineyard architecture, but also to develop the mechanization technology needed to manage this new vineyard architecture. It started here with the Diet Pepsi can and some wooden doweling to conceive how we would go about putting a mechanical shoe positioner into an orientation that would work in our new vineyard architecture. And here is what it looks like a few years later, with many modifications being made. This is our new Michigan State mechanical shoe positioner. The details of this will have to be presented in another time, but it is through development and it is fully operational as of 2012. And this is what it looks like going down the row, and it's fairly gentle on the vines in its final modification. These are vines that had been through the spring freeze, so the shoe growth is more modest at this time than it might be normally. The next phase of our work will involve modifying this pollenk pruner that we have used in our Concord Vineyard at the Southwest Research and Extension Center for many years. And we're going to modify this pruner so it will accommodate and do a good job on that two-tier cordon on a 7-foot trellis. And that's all we have to report for now. We thank you for your attention. We certainly hope to proceed with this project next year and the year beyond to fully implement the technology to fully mechanize our new model Concord Vineyard.